Hello, ladies, gentlemen, and everything in between. It's Jin'taan here, and I'm sitting alongside Ashterothi. And today we're going to be concluding our little mini series on the four empires of EVE Online and going kind of deep on their lore. Isn't that right, Ashterothi?
That is correct, Jin'taan. We've been kind of circling this group. A lot of the other groups have very long and interesting lore. The Minmatar is probably one of the least focused on, fleshed out of all of them, and so we've left it for last, so that way we can kind of flesh out the rest of the universe and see what everybody else was doing. So that way maybe we can better understand what happened to the Minmatar.
Yeah, and I think an important part of this, and this is kind of the conversation that we were having before we got into this, is almost the fact that the Minmatar are by necessity an empire with less less development than the other areas than the other races, because they have spent so much time being focused on as a player in someone else's story. Like, we hear about their interactions with the Galante, we hear about their interactions with the Amarr Empire, but all of those interactions revolved from this starting point of the Minmatar Republic not existing effectively. That's where everything comes from. Everything comes after this major event, the Minmatar Rebellion. And that's something we're going to get to way later. But before that point, everything is very, very deliberately obscured and made difficult. And that's by the deliberate force of the Amarr. And that's something that makes it very difficult to then figure out what happened right at the start of the Minmatar's story. So all we have are kind of these oral histories, these almost campfire rumors of what life was like, alongside a little bit of confirmed stuff that we have from either source and other out of character sources.
Right, but there is an in-universe reason for this as well, which makes a lot of sense, which is that basically this is a culture whose entire history has been eradicated twice, right? When the Amarr enslaved the Minmatar, they didn't care to preserve the Minmatar culture. In fact, quite the opposite. They did everything they could to eradicate what was left, or what culture that they had, and subsume them into the Amarr faith. That was the entire point of the reclaiming, which again we'll get into later. But and then once they did get their freedom, they then turned around and eradicated all the culture that the Amarr had left behind. So what the records and a lot of the stuff that we would have had from that time is likewise destroyed. So really what we do know about them is more about their influence on the outside world and what they are now, which is a reconstruction, a somewhat reconstruction of what they supposedly were in the beginning. So without further ado, I think we should start at the beginning.
Yeah, so let's start with the planet that the Minmatar grew up on, because this is something that we've kind of discussed a lot in these previous episodes, is just how much the environment that the society developed in flavors the society that comes after as it sort of becomes more advanced and gains access to more technology. How they develop culturally is very dependent on where they grew up. So you have the Caldari being this very austere, very hyper-nationalistic force built around megacorporations, although that's less dependent on their surroundings, just because they grew up in this very cold, very inhospitable planet. The Galante, they had this very small but very centralized planet with, I believe, only one or two continents that allowed this much larger civilization to form. In the Amarr, you have this fragmented world where there is a wide diversity of cultures, and that wide diversity of cultures eventually led to the development of the most imperialistic culture, the one that would dominate all other cultures, and then that monoculture expanded from there. And then finally, we get to the Minmatar, and the Minmatar have what is undoubtedly the best planet you could possibly ask for. It's like you put your RimWorld settings on the easiest possible settings, because the planet that the Minmatar, not subspecies, I don't know why I keep trying to call them species. That's not correct. They're all humans. That's an important thing to note to people who are watching, is that they're all humans. They're just called races for reasons. And anyway, it's a huge planet. It's very hospitable. It's very fertile. There are these large plains. There's tons of room to expand, and because of that, society is relatively slow to expand because it takes so long for ideas and people and things to travel around the planet. At least that's from what I understand it to be.
Right. The planet of Pator. No, sorry. The planet of Matar, in the solar system of Pator, is effectively a Gaia planet, right? Like it is super lush and whatnot. And so, when the Eve Gate collapsed, these guys, like their culture collapsed, but they didn't die because there are plenty of resources. And so they they kind of fell into these tribes that for a long time didn't even have any communication with one another. And so there's actually this reforming of the tribes at some point. But one of the things I find most interesting about this particular entry in the lore is that it really puts into perspective the timeline of these things. So the colonization of CMS Tax 17, which would later be known as the Pator system, actually occurred in AD 8017. So that would be in 3,098 years, 3,998 years from now. Six, 5, somewhere in there. So not too long from now, a few thousand years. Whereas the occupation of the Amarr occurred in AD 22,355. So we've talked about, and a long time has passed. Well, here we have some dates, right? So from the time of the occupation of the Pator system to the occupation of the Amarr of the Matari people was roughly 14,000 years.
Yeah, the effectively what it looks like is the end of the Eve Gate basically resets civilization to around prehistory. It takes about 10,000 years for them to go from the Eve Gate collapsing, which obviously collapses the entire pre-Matarian civilization, and it takes until 10,000 years later for these civilizations to start coming back in contact with one another and kind of entering the, probably early Bronze Age kind of levels of technology. I think that would be the most appropriate equivalent. That's kind of the timeline that you work with. And then after that, you do get 3,000 to 4,000 more years of just slow growth at kind of, I guess, the pace that we would expect from our own history to taking place. And it is basically just a refounding of all of the technological states that we went through as a civilization on Earth, just in different surroundings.
Right. So while each of the other empires had their own like proto empires that rose and in most of the cases fell, but in one case didn't, the Minmatar never really had that need. There's too many resources. They didn't need to pull together in that sort of way. So they functioned as independent tribes, but it also made it so that they didn't develop as fast as everybody else. They had developed space travel by the time the Amarr had gotten there. But it was more colonization than military. So, but just to wrap this up as we go into the story, I just want to point out that the other piece to all of this, and the reason why it's somewhat confusing, is because the Matari people are very spiritual people. And so they see a lot of their story from a very spiritual lens. And so it's difficult to know, almost from like a historian perspective, what actually went on. When they describe the elders becoming their Talrog form, did they really become angels, or was there some other explanation, or is this just a legend that has been passed down over the generations? So there's a lot of that kind of muddiness when it comes to the story. But what we do know is that the Minmatar people lived on this planet for a long time. And by 2374, there was a general peace, and they were starting to become unified into an order, more or less, right? And then about 2,000 years later comes the Day of Darkness.
I think before we go to the Day of Darkness, we should introduce the tribes and the concept of the tribal society that predates it a little bit as well.
Sure thing. That's a great idea. So in the same way that the corporations, the mega corporations are the division of the Caldari, and that you're born into your mega corporation, in the Minmatar Republic, there are tribes, clans, and circles. And the largest order are these tribes. The tribes of the Matari are multiple families bound together in a as a group that have a progenitor. There is what's known as the first elders. So in a very almost Vampire the Masquerade-esque sort of way, you have these very like deific people, these elders who kind of define the tone of each of their groups, and those become the various tribes. So each of the tribes can trace themselves to a specific leader, which now functions as a pseudo deity for that tribe.
Yeah, and there are, I believe, 7 tribes, although you can only pick to play as 4 of them, I think. And the first is the Sebastor, who are the largest tribe, I believe, and they're supposedly like the innovative thinkers of the cluster. You have the Brutor, who are, the very prototypical noble warrior types, although they have a dark side, obviously, because most of these tribes have a dark side, because as you'll learn, most things in EVE Online have a real dark side to them. There are no good people in this story. You have the Cruasul, who are the sneaky people, basically, the elves, as it were. The Veracor, who are just known of being very versatile and adaptive. But then you get into the more interesting ones. You have the Nefantar, who we don't really know what they were originally known for, but what we know them for now is that they are the tribe that ended up collaborating with the Amarr Empire. And that's something, again, that we're going to come back to later on. And you also have the Thukka tribe, who were known as these very nomadic people who didn't settle in cities and would be constantly moving around Mator and other planets. And they are separate from what we come to know as the Minmatar Republic. And then finally we have the Starkmanir, who were thought to be totally destroyed by the Amarr after they fermented their own rebellion, and they were one of the first proto-rebellions to be crushed by the Amarr. And however, they actually ended up surviving, and that's something we'll get onto later. But yeah, those are your 7 tribes of the Minmatar, and they're all led by elders. And this is something that's going to come back to, I don't want to say haunt the Minmatar people, but the fact that there is this incredibly important power structure that exists outside of the government is something that plays heavily into Minmatar politics going down the road and towards the post Minmatar rebellion kind of landscape.
So to understand the tribes, I find it best to understand the first elders, because again they set the tone for everything. So you mentioned the tribes. You'll be able to figure it out probably if you do 2 and 2. But Sebes of the Spessor tribe was innovative. He was a thinker and a developer. Nephin was patient, practical, and dedicated. Thuk was nomadic, individualistic, and self-sufficient. Varoka was versatile, welcoming, and the wise teacher. Stark was tall, quick, and stoic. See, King of the North. Remember? I made that joke earlier. Brute was martial, disciplined, and strong, and Crus was subversive, cunning, and aberrant. So these are both the progenitors, the first elders, but also kind of, again, sets the tone for each of those groups. So as you heard his description of them, he described the practical, what they've been up to and what they've done. But this is like the DNA. This is what they are, which is, I think, a really interesting.
They're expected to be, perhaps.
Right. Well, again, this is their deity. So their deity functions as like this rallying force. This is how they align themselves voluntarily.
Although there are some things in Minmatar society that are not particularly voluntary, like the tattooing process, which is very weird and wonderful. And I don't know if we want to touch on that now or wait until a little later.
I think, I mean, we could talk about it because we could basically, this is historical tribal Minmatar. And I think this is an important part of it, which is that they have this idea of the tattoo, which to them, in my opinion, it really shows like the what a tattoo can mean. Like there are tribes that have very meaningful tattoos, but their tattoos function, and it's almost like an ID system as well as a prophecy and almost like a sorting hat, like a caste system of sorts. You talked about this actually in your previous video that I thought was really interesting. But so they have multiple tattoos, right? Some are more practical, and then there's the more spiritual ones.
Yeah, they're effectively just placed on you by tribal artists. It's a very, very spiritual process to the Minmatar. It's something that is almost, I don't want to say religious because that doesn't work with how they function, but it's something that is very keenly interjected with how the Minmatar people see themselves, because it isn't just a mark of what you are trying to be or what you might become. Your tattoos are everything to do with your person. They are your destiny. They are what you've done. They're what you want to do. And but it's also not something that you can willingly choose what's put on you. You can't just choose to have the most badass tattoo. The most badass tattoo is bestowed upon you because the people who give those tattoos are culturally expected to have a good ability to understand what you are going to be in the future. So it is almost this ritualistic, spiritualistic thing, but it's not quite religious. And I find it really fascinating how alien they've managed to make that part of the culture feel, because you can get tattoos that will completely destroy your life and that's completely out of your control. And that is something that I talked about in my video, which should come up in the suggestions, hopefully, if YouTube's being nice, which is why the Minmatar Republic sucks.
Right. And I find it funny that you see it as being so alien to you, because so one of the things that a lot of people may not know about me is that I was actually born in Hawaii. And there, my parents took me to a tribal elder where they had a vision, and I had a name bestowed upon me, and that's my middle name. So this kind of concept is not alien to me. And now the idea of it like completely destroying your life, that's probably not cool. But the idea of an elder bestowing upon you your fate in some indelible message is very practical. Or not very practical, but not uncommon, I should say.
This is probably the point in the episode where I am going to raise my headcanon theory about some of the downsides to the Minmatar traditions and cultures, because there are a couple other things in the culture that just, they don't make sense and they seem purely negative. And my suspicion is that some of the darker sides to Minmatar culture were not originally a part of Minmatar culture, but are effectively the Minmatar incorporating the myths that the Amarr Empire held about their culture.
Right.
Because they aren't educated enough in what their old culture used to be due to the Amarr Empire actively trying to erase it from history. And I think that's really interesting.
They think that they're rebuilding their history, but what they're really doing is buying into Amarrian propaganda of the savages of the Minmatar before the reclaiming, is what you're suggesting. And
exactly.
I like that idea.
Yeah. It's one that really appeals to me because it's just so dark and twisted. It feels appropriate. All right, so now we've got that out of the way, we understand where Minmatar society is before their contact with the outside world. They live in this vast, beautiful planet. They have a society that is slowly advancing, but it's mostly peaceful, and their government effectively revolves around an agreement between agreements between the tribal elders, and everyone lives in this great worldwide tribal society until a storm happens.
Yeah, this is another great example of that. Is this a faith thing? Is it a coincidence? What? But basically, one day, this big storm crosses over the land and covers the world in darkness. And at that exact same time, the Amarr show up. And the Amarr quickly crush any defenses that the Minmatar have and rapidly go about the process of subjugating the Minmatar people and turning them into their new slave empire. What's interesting about that is that it doesn't expressly say that the Amarr caused the storm. It's almost as if there's this ill omen that it functioned as a precursor to the Amarr attack. So even this moment is drenched in their kind of pseudo-religious philosophy. But either way, the entire planet of Patar was taken over. And while the Minmatar people had actually started to colonize other planets within the planet of Matar, my bad, in the planet of Pater, or the system of Pater, they had colonized other planets within the Pater system, but really they did not have the ability to defend themselves against the Amarr. And so the Amarr had no reservations. They didn't hold off. They rallied them up, put them on boats, shipped them out, and did everything they could to permanently enslave them.
Yeah, and that's kind of where the Minmatar story stops for a little bit. Although there are things to start to carry through there, like we mentioned earlier, the Nefantar were the Minmatar tribe that ended up working with the Amarr during this period to kind of keep the peace, because these raids weren't consistent. It wasn't like the Amarrians came in, they took all the population back to the homeworld, and that was it, they were done. These raids continued for decades and decades and decades, and during that time they had to keep this planet pacified. And to do that, they used local collaborators who would later become known as the Avatar. But equally, not all of that collaboration was being done in good faith. And this is where we get to the topic of the Stark Mynir.
Right.
They were actually some progenitors of the Stark Mynir tribe were secreted away by the Nefantar during this period so that they could later basically rejoin the universe in well after the Minmatar Rebellion and the establishment of the Minmatar Republic.
Yeah, I think that you buried the lead there a little bit. The Stark Mynir are very interesting. So you're right. The group that you just mentioned, I keep on wanting to call them the Nephilim, but that's not what they are. The Nefantar are and the Stark Mynir were both they both tried to work with the Amarr rather than rebel against the Amarr, until such a time that the Stark Mynir were taken over effectively. They removed the Stark Mynir's elder and put in a Amarr holder. Sorry, my bad. They had a holder that was controlling the Stark Mynir, Arzaz Hamri, who was executed, and then the highly orthodox Archon Ardashapur being some of the most orthodox Amarrians there are, took over and was very oppressive to the Stark Mynir. So they rebelled and ended up killing Archon Ardashapur, and this led to the Amarr orbitally bombarding the planet with tachyon lasers, destroying the entire Stark Mynir tribe, just eradicated off the face of the universe. And so the other group that was relatively friendly, the Nefantar, saw that moment as like, oh shit, like these guys aren't going to mess with us. Like they're not going to be nice to us. They're not going to They're not going to work with us. This is where they're at. Like, we're not going to get on their good side. And so it took 250 years from the destruction of the San Mentir, but that they say that moment was the seed that would eventually be the fuse that would lead to the Minmatar rebellion.
Although that had to wait until a little more fortuitous of an occasion to actually work.
Correct. Like I said, it took another 250 years because now they had the will to rebel, but they needed the opportunity. So, as you pointed out, the Nefintir took this opportunity to take the few San Mentir that were still around and effectively incorporated them into their own culture, such that they can kind of smuggle them out and keep them safe. And so now they've become part of the Anmatar, which was discovered and was a bit of a problem, but eventually, like, they managed to get away with it, more or less. So there are still some, and after that led to another rebellion, which led to more Anmatar, a fair chunk of the Anmatar now defecting back over to the Minmatar. This was back in like what, YC 112, I want to say. But either way, we are definitely getting ahead of ourselves. So 250 years after the San Mentir uprising, you now have on the Amarr, who have now come into contact with the Gallente and the Caldari Federation. The Gallente Federation and the Caldari state. And they see them as too big of a problem. They can't, taking over either of those people seem very hard for the Amarr, but especially since they're busy fighting among themselves, so that Minmatar don't really have, or the Amarr don't really have to worry about them at the moment. But nearby the Amarr is this other smaller group of people known as the Jovian, who have at this point not really interacted with people too much. They seem technologically advanced, but they're not terribly large. And so the Amarr decide to make their move on the Jove, and which leads to the Battle of Vak'atioth, which we discussed in the Amarr history lesson, as it were.
Just to make a long story short, effectively what happened is the Amarr lost, and they lost badly.
Yeah, so this was not only the first loss by the Amarr to an alien or to another species or culture. It is the most significant, and it was a huge loss to the Golden Fleet, and the Minmatar, with some help from the Gallente, took this as their opportunity to host their full-fledged rebellion.
Yeah, and it was a very bloody affair. Both sides absolutely basically embraced whatever extremists they could to kind of further their cause of separation. And obviously this was a two-front war. So this was happening whilst the Amarrians were still preparing to potentially fend off the Jove in the north. And obviously that leads to some rumors that, given how quickly a peace ended up being signed between the Amarr and the Jove, that maybe the Jove had a little more to do with the Minmatar rebellion than they let on. But again, that's all conspiracy talk.
Well, that goes back to the idea of the Torog form and the first elders and the artifacts. There's one of the leading ideas is that in the very early days of the Minmatar Republic, they actually received help from what would then be the Jove / Eheduani, that gave them kind of an up in the world, that helped them in their development, which we now know as the legend of the elders and the artifacts.
Mm-hmm. And obviously the Minmatar were given assistance by the Gallente Federation during this time too.
Right. So this really has to do with the process by which the Amarr maintain their enslavement. They have two major mechanisms for enslavement of the Minmatar. They have transneural cranial controllers, I think is what they're, I don't remember the exact name now. But they are effectively zombie making machines that the Amarr put into their Minmatar slave. But the problem is that those don't allow higher functions. So if you just need somebody to basically be a drone worker, that's great. But if you need somebody to think for themselves, or do a finer task that requires skill, then you can't just shut off. You can't lobotomize them with these transneural encoders or whatever. So what they use is this drug, and the drug is known as Vitok. And the drug is pretty cool, and it's come in multiple forms. So it's not just one substance. But basically, the concept of it is that it is a drug that has a withdrawal symptom of death. So if you don't keep coming to your Amarrian masters, you will die of Vitok withdrawal. Now, the Gallente at this time, using their technology that they, their advanced technology that they had developed by this point, started working on various cures to Vitok. And so what you see is this arms race between the Gallente and the Amarr to develop, the Amarr want to develop a more powerful Vitok, and the Gallente want to crack it open. Until now, the Amarr have developed this incredibly nasty virus-like drug version of Vitok that they haven't been able to find a cure for because it mutates and changes in a ways that they can't deal with, and it is far more brutal. The death from it is very painful, and that is the Amarrians' current solution to keeping the Minmatar under their control. Because remember, even after this Minmatar rebellion, over half of the Minmatar remain still under Amarrian enslavement.
And not all of the Minmatar even decide to stay within the Minmatar society that forms after that. A good portion of them end up inside the Gallente Federation as well.
That's right. So once they did get freedom, they got freedom in part because of the Gallente Federation, and the Gallente did what they do, which is like, hey, now that we're friends, we're going to we're going to show you how good democracy is, and we're going to show you how good it is by making you use it. So the Minmatar kind of made this show government that appeases the Gallente, but really the Minmatar people went back, did their best to go back to their roots. That was a big priority for them. And so those who were more progressive and democracy focused, they moved away. They left the Minmatar Republic and they moved to the Gallente. Those who were proud of their tribal history were more likely to stay behind and be part of the Minmatar Republic. And notably, the Thucker tribe, who were already pretty nomadic, were like, go back to Mater again, and just so that way the next group of people can come and get us. Nah, screw that. We're going to go become space nomads for the rest of our existence. Each subset of the Matari people kind of made a decision of where they wanted to go once their freedom was established, which of course makes the Matari people the most spread out among the galaxy, and also the most known for things like smuggling and drug running and kind of being at the fringes of society. Basically, once they were freed, they spent some time with, like I said, they really went about trying to establish themselves and their new culture. So they went back to being the traditional tribes, even though some of them had kind of disgraced themselves during the process of the rebellion. Those who kind of remained most pure and whatnot became kind of the strongest of the tribes, which is why Bruder, Cursal, and Sebester are the three that we play as, because those are now like kind of the most dominant. And we have as I mentioned, this kind of pseudo democratic process. So you have this Senate, which is the parliament, which is ostensibly to make laws for the Minmatar Republic as a whole, but in the same like states laws versus federal laws of the United States, the parliamentarian laws of the Minmatar Republic are not allowed to be supersede any tribal law. So tribal law always has mandate. The entire function of the and the other higher Minmatar functions they're very similar to the Caldari state in the fact that like the state doesn't have a formal government entity that runs things. The corporations run things, and then collectively the corporations have various things. They have the Council of CEOs, and they have the people that are like assigned to officiate stuff. Minmatar are very similar in that regard. So they have the Sanmatar, which is their leader, but not quite leader. Like he's not the head of state, but for all effective functions external to the Minmatar, he functions as the head of state. He's kind of he's the head of the tribal council, right? But even then, he's not like the loudest voice of the tribal council. He's just the guy who's assigned to making sure that everything gets taken care of. Now, the current Samotar does have a lot of authority, and there's a lot of politics to this all. But fundamentally, the upper echelons of the parliament have very little actual authority. The tribal council have ultimate authority, and then the tribal council bestows upon the prime minister and the parliament the authority to make decisions, which basically means at any time the tribal council can be like, nah, we don't like you, we're going to get somebody else. And so the tribes are still an ultimate authority, but they've created this democrat looking system or democracy looking system that sits on top of it to appease the Gallente. As time has gone on, in much of the same way as the Caldari, the Gallente and the Minmatar have not always seen eye to eye. We were making the joke earlier before the show that the Gallente are really good at making friends and really bad at keeping them. They can be attractive to a group, but then once you hang out with them enough, you realize that they're just kind of dicks. So over the years, the Minmatar have had various different small slights between them and the Gallente, to the point where at this point they're not hostile, but I would almost go so far as to call them antagonistic to one another at various different degrees, especially certain subsections of the organizations. I know that the relationship between the Samotar and Roden, the president of the Gallente Federation, as depicted in Templar 1, is very chess gamey, right? Like very high politicking. You can tell that they are working with each other because they gain an advantage for working with the other. But if they could figure out a way to intimidate the other person into subduing, then they would definitely go for it. So there's a tense friendship between the Gallente and the Minmatar.
In the defense of the Minmatar, the Gallente Federation are basically that like partner that is just going, hey, yeah, but how much do you really love me? Yeah, but how much do you really love me? Just constantly. How much do you really love democracy?
You're part of us now. You're like there's a lot at its worst. There are Minmatar that see the Gallente as little more than the Amarr. Like basically a different kind of slavery. Be like, yes, you're free, and this is how you should be free. Combine that with the extensive spy network and other, things like that the Gallente use. There's plenty of good reasons to be untrusting of your ally in this case. That being said, there's also some other interesting controversy. The Sanmatar himself, which is also just another appointed choice who could be replaced at any time. That's kind of important because most recently it was kind of a big deal that the Sanmatar showed up to the coronation of Catis Tashmerkon, Empress of the Amarr. That was seen as a big deal. Either however you looked at it, either as a gesture of peace or as a what are you doing? There's some interesting things about that because the Minmatar are not necessarily happy with the fact that he did that. So the question is that weakening his position? How much power does the infrastructure, the inner structure of the Minmatar have? In sine wave omega, we discover that the Thucker were key pieces, key group, or key to the smuggling out of alpha clone technology. So the SOE, using drifter, derived from drifter technology, they developed the alpha clone, and the Thucker were used to smuggle the tech out to the various empires. We know this because the Minmatar is basically berating the representative of the Thucker tribe, complaining to him that, you know, that the Thucker should have brought it to them first, given them first opportunity, and not have been fair, quote unquote, about it. Another thing about the Thucker tribe that's particularly interesting is in Valkyrie. In Eve Valkyrie, you have the Quartermaster. The Quartermaster is a very powerful dude that seems to be associated with the Guristas and the Valkyries. Lots and lots of money, and seems to be particularly interested in what we eventually learn to be drifter technology. At the very end, he's hunting for something the whole time, and in the final map, we find that the thing that he's hunting for is a drifter hive. So everything up until that point is kind of defined by that, which is important because basically he discovers the location of a secret base, and then he aligns a Stargate to that base, and then he goes to the base and raids it for its information, and then using that information, that's how he finds the drifter hive. Why am I bringing this up? Because if you go to that base and you look around, you can see very clearly that that base is a Thucker tribe base. So the Thucker are very much attached to this whole drifter stuff. In fact, a Thucker caravan disappeared during this. It was either the Salient incident or Caroline Star. No, at Caroline Star, they found the remnants of the caravan in one of the shattered wormholes. So some of these dudes have their fingers, or their elbow into the crap, as it were, when it comes to the current conspiracy storyline, if you're into that kind of thing.
Getting a little bit back to the topic of this kind of weird two-layered system that the Minmatar have adopted, one of the things that makes that system so interesting is that the tribal elders, so the people who lead the tribal council, which isn't the same as the Republic Senate, it's its own little sub-body of group of very powerful people who aren't technically elected, they're effectively born into their position. Although it's not a monarchy, I'm not entirely. Yeah, they are selected by the people they rule by, but it's not a democracy. It's complicated.
Well, they have a thing where the elders, so like they're not only are the first elders like these divine beings, but they feel that these elders guide and almost possess their successors. So the new elder is chosen, and so the leader of a tribe is the elder of that tribe, and it's believed that when that elder dies, their spirit becomes one with the first elder and continues to grow their collective spirit.
Right, but these living tribal elders, the ones that are not quite as deific, but are the actual people who end up in control of these tribes, the actual elders, they have an immense amount of political and cultural power, and they started to leverage that inside the Republic and build up their own base of support, and more importantly, their own fleet and their own armies. And that really came to a head in YC 1110, with what is probably the biggest Minmatar lore event, at least in my opinion, that we saw during the time of the Capsulia. And that is the Elder War.
I'm so glad that you bring this up, because the end of this story is actually going to go into a major correction that I have from a previous video. But that tantalizing hint aside, so what we have here is the Minmatar federal or fleet navy, effectively working with the Thucker tribe, which again has been relatively independent since the formation of the Minmatar Republic. Yeah, so they worked together to form this crazy powerful fleet, including a Titan, and they basically punch directly towards Amarr. Now, at this same time, the Amarrian emperor had recently been assassinated, And so there was no formal leader of the Amarr, and it was being ran by the Chancellor, who is organizing towards the next succession trial, but was also sort of just seizing power for himself.
It's very complicated. Go and watch the Amarr video if you want to hear more about it.
Right. So long story short, the Minmatar make it all the way to Sorum Prime, which is pretty darn far up the path, very close to Amarr Prime itself, the home system of the Sorum family. And they made it to the planet of Mechios when they encountered the Amarrian fleet, and they began to fight. And out of warp comes the believed to be deceased Jamil Sorum, who had been magically resurrected by God, and then used the power of God to crush the Elder fleet in a single shot. And then that followed up with a whole bunch of like routing of the Elder group. But this basically was the beginning of the end of the Elder fleet attack on the Amarr.
We should note that the Elder Fleet didn't just attack the Amarr, though. They also attacked Concord.
That's true. I skipped over that because I still have no idea what the hell that was for.
I think it's pretty obvious what that's for, because Concord is still was at this point a militarized force, because this is after the rise of the Capsuleer, after the First Empyrean War. So this is once Concord has already become the Jovian militaristic power that it is now in lore. So if you want to take a fleet off the table, you've got to basically do 2 surprise attacks. You've got to attack the person. It's kind of like the Schlieffen plan from World War One. You've got to take out Concord so that you can take out the Amarr at the same time. So they led this surprise attack on Uli. They went in there with a ton of dreadnoughts, a ton of hacks, a ton of battleships, and they basically just sat there and kept Concord trapped in Uli with one task force, whilst their other task force just burned for Amarr with the hope of basically toppling the Amarr Empire before all the other empires could react to their sudden and decisive strike.
And yet, if we do this, they call it exploiting. So if you can actually go to Uli and see the destroyed station to this day, you can actually dock in it, but it's definitely it's broken up. It's pretty interesting. But yeah, so this Elder fleet was very destructive and kind of showed it's the tippy top of military force that the Minmatar as an organization has ever manifested. Now, the correction that I have, if we can just digress for just a minute, is in the Amarrian episode, I believe, I said that Jamil, they found this super weapon at the same time as they're cloning Jamil, and then Jamil threw the super weapon into the sun, and that's what caused the detonation. This is actually not true. When I was investigating to find out the other's real role in all of this, what I found out was actually it wasn't that the other convinced Jamil to throw the weapon into the sun. The other is what led them to the weapon in the first place. So once the other controlled Jamil, the other basically taught Jamil where this super weapon was, and how to use it. And so they were able to recover it and use it in order to stop the Elder fleet. But, and this is the part I'm still unclear with, it seems like at some point the super weapon was abandoned. When it was next seen, it was actually seen as the rogue drones had actually captured it and had brought it into the center of one of its colonies, like basically was protecting it in the core of this rogue drone hive. Eventually it was stumbled upon by the Thucker, the Blood Raiders, and I think one other group. And the Blood Raiders were attempting to extract the super weapon from, the Abaddon with super weapon from the rogue drone hive. And the Thucker was trying to stop it. And eventually they were trying to fight the rogue drones. The rogue drones was fighting them off. and they convince the rogue drones to let them destroy it. And so the Thucker tribe member shoots at the cache, the Isogen 5 cache that was collected there, and it detonated. And that is what caused the chain reaction that would be later known as the Salient incident, or the Apocrypha event. So same thing with the superweapon, quantumly entangled, all that stuff is the same, but wasn't thrown in the sun. That was Star Wars. Instead, it was the this kind of standoff between the Thuckers, the Blood Raiders, and the rogue drones.
Okay, so after the Elder War, you obviously have the ramifications of the political system of the Minmatar realizing just how incredibly vulnerable it is to basically the tyranny of the Elders. But it doesn't really do anything about that because Minmatar society in general almost wants that because of how the tribal elders are seen within Minmatar society. They are effectively seen as people that divorce themselves from their personal power and try and do what's best for the tribe. It's all very complicated. But following that, we don't really get that much happening until the election of the next Minmatar. At least from my understanding.
I think you are now entering into territory that I'm not 100% up on. I know that the Malakuth Shakur is the Minmatar. One of the things I find most interesting about Malakuth Shakur himself is that he's blind, which I find to be a very interesting trait for a head of state.
Okay, so Malakuth Shakur is the current Minmatar, so the current president of the Minmatar, as it were. And as we talked about, he's just appointed to this position. And he is the son of a brutal Defiant. And the Defiants are a very interesting story unto themselves. So basically, they are a subsection of the brutal tribe that splintered off from the main brutal tribe as a result of their harsh treatment by the Amarrians that left them with basically a almost genetic blindness disease. So all of his family is blind as well. And as a result of that, a lot of the Defiants actually go on to join the Defiant Splinter faction, which is a terrorist group outside of the Minmatar Republic that works to try and free slaves, kind of like the Tribal Liberation Federation. But yeah, he disappeared for a while. Like that's the only thing I know about him is that he disappeared for like 2 years and then he came back and became the president like a couple of months later.
I know that he's important, and then Midular, he's or she is the other main person worth noting. So
yeah, it's unfortunate that we just don't know as much about this, and this is kind of what you were talking about earlier on, is that the Minmatar are kind of one of the biggest missed opportunities with Eve lore, because there just isn't that much there for them. There's not that much detail about a lot of the systems. There's not that much detail about like the political configuration of all the tribes. They just kind of exist to almost be acted upon a lot of the time in the lore. They're kind of like the OG Imperial Guards in 40k, from people who remember that.
Well,
where their lore is they die a lot.
I mean, I think that the Minmatar really reflect both the best parts and the worst parts, or the biggest weaknesses of CCP's way of handling the lore. So it has this very interesting, complex story in which the bad guys are never that bad and the good guys are never that good. And there's a lot of stuff about ramification and family and all these really cool stories that could be derived from it. And yet, like, if I want to invest in this and I make myself my own character, I can choose my tattoos. And everywhere in the lore, it says how important these tattoos are and that they mean things and that they care about what they are. And yet I have no idea which tattoos are which in game. So if I wanted my character to somehow relate to this lore, I can't. I don't have that option. And I think that that's the real mistake, is that if you're going to have this beautiful, rich history, then give us the tools to feel like we're living in it. And I think that that works a lot with like things like the Amarr a lot better because of the idea of the holders and the families and the houses that people can align themselves to. But the Minmatar are such a rich culture that they legitimately are a foreign culture to us. And it'd be nice to have more of the ability to kind of climb into that headspace more.
Yeah, we literally only know the name of about, I think, like 10 tattoos off the top of my head. Like, you've got the Ray of Matar, which is considered like the biggest, grandest, greatest thing to receive, and then we know a ton of bad ones from this one, like this one chronicle, which is about the Voluval, which is effectively the coming of age ritual for the Minmatar. It's when they get their first tattoo. It's considered incredibly important. It's where we get all that prophecy stuff that we talked about earlier on in the episode. So we know about things like the spiraling circle, the scarecrow, the purple cross, the slaver's fang, the pale eye, the face of Helenia, the broken shield. But other than those, we just don't really know that much. Like, what are some
We
of the
know
minor,
they exist, but we don't know what
and we
they
don't even
look
know what they
like.
mean. And we don't even know what they mean either.
That's fair. Yeah, I mean, that's a big thing for me. Like, I don't even think I could make a Minmatar character right now because I would want my character to be correct, quote unquote. And if there is no ability to ensure that you are correct, then if I choose a tattoo, like what if I, like there are some people that believe one of the two of the tattoos that are available are actually the Ray of Matar, which by the way is like the highest level, like chosen one level tattoo you can receive. So if that's true, then like there's a bunch of people just randomly picking it, not even knowing what it means. Like if I pick something, will somebody else see it as being something else? Like it just frustrates me that if we're going to have this deep tattoo culture, then let's go one layer deeper and actually know what it is. That's what I would like.
Yeah, and also it's just one that there isn't quite as much, I think, room to have obvious storylines in the Minmatar. Like, you can always do Game of Thrones with the Amarr. You can always do corporate intrigue with the Caldari. You can always do the day-to-day of general, like, democratic politics in the Galante Federation. You know, I can absolutely see there being, like, we've already had, for example, the Caldari Corporation Cup, which determined some law stuff, which is players fighting. We've had the Amarian Succession Championship, the Amarr Championships twice. And theoretically, I suppose we could have like a Galante.
Elections at the beginning of next year.
Oh yes, I'm really excited for that actually.
Yep, they announced it in the last news update.
That's gonna be fun. But there's unlikely to be something similar to that from the Minmatar Republic because they're a different form of government, and I think they're a form of government that people don't have as much practical experience with in the terms of the day-to-day stuff and understanding how that might impact your character. And because of that, you have this kind of empty void of nuance where the Minmatar kind of just get labeled as one thing and there isn't much to do with them.
Well, one thing and nothing at the same time. It's like, oh yeah, they're just the lost people basically. So they're, like I said, they're the smugglers and all the, any negative stereotypes of, the displaced people. Just put it on the Minmatar and you're probably good to go. There has actually been some lore updates. I'm looking it up right now. The real issue is that, like, when it comes to other things, like when the Amarr restructure, to your point, when the Amarr restructure, I can easily understand what that means, right? When Cactus says that now everybody has their own military and that the Sorum family is arguing with the Artisburg family, I get that. I can understand that. But there's like this weird whole thing about these dudes known as the Sundale Six who were part of some uprising, who were then arrested, and then the Subjugation tribe wanted to put them on trial, and then they're on their way, and then they got broken out, and now they're at large. Like there is some weird, like there is some lore going on with the Minmatar stuff, but just like everything else, it's kind of so obscure that it's almost difficult to. It doesn't make a good narrative. So I'm not out here telling the story about the Sundale Six yet because we don't have enough information to do that. In the same way as, like, I can even tell you the story of the Intaki takeover that's going on by Lidai Corporation. That has kind of a narrative that makes a lot of sense. But we have all, I mean, like the lore for Minmatar, we get things like Brutor clans and Metar condemn Ramijozan mud wrestling plan as unseemly after petition in Makur Murka. Like, that's the kind of news that we get. Oh, okay. I don't know what to do with that.
Yeah. So, do you have any more details that you think might be interesting to bring forwards on the Minmatar? Like, what are they? Well, we know a little bit about their day-to-day life. Like, we know that they're one of the obviously least developed empires economically. They're kind of very dependent on the Galante Federation for a lot of their economic success, which I think is interesting. And probably explains why you got that very chess game feeling from the meeting between the two leaders of the state, as it were. Because obviously one of them is very dependent on the other, but they also want to try and be independent themselves. I don't know where I was going with that, sorry.
Yeah, it's fine. I mean, I agree with you on it. I was distracted a little bit because I'm trying to look it through the lore recently, because as I said, there's a lot of stuff going on that involve Minmatar groups, right? The different tribes are doing things and all that stuff. But I feel like I'm still a little bit too much of an outsider to be able to piece it all together. So maybe this becomes kind of like a call for help. If there's a different group, or if there's somebody out there, maybe in Urshikon or something like that, that has a better understanding of kind of the current going-ons, because I know it's very complicated. And I know there's some of it involving like Khanid and other stuff that's more obvious, but like the internal Minmatar stuff right now, if somebody understands that and wants to break it down for me, I'd really appreciate it. Shoot, that made me think of something, but now I think that the big thing is that the Thucker tribe function has been very active as a proxy entity for the Minmatar Republic within the current like active storyline, the emergent threat storyline. And so I continue to be interested to see how the Minmatar Republic are going to use this current situation with the Triglavians and the Drifters and everything else to kind of try to gain a leg up. Meanwhile, we also have, as I mentioned, there's almost like a weakening of the Sanmatar to a certain extent. I could be wrong, but it seemed that way after the coronation of Katis, as people begin to not necessarily believe that he's representing them as well as they probably would like. So there is definitely the seeds there for something to happen. There have been standoffs between the Minmatar and the Amarr. But once again, it's difficult to know anything that isn't just defined by their relationship with another organization.
Yep. All right. Well, do you want to wrap it up for this time, or do we? There's more to kind of really explore here.
Life in, well, you usually ask me about like life growing up in the Minmatar Republic, and I think that we've covered a lot of that with things like the tattoo and everything like that. But basically, this goes into the way that their society is organized. I mentioned earlier that there's clans, there is tribes. No, hold on. Tribes, clans, and circles, right? So within a tribe, several families will be bundled together, or several people within the families of the tribe will be bundled together in a clan. And a clan is like a subset of a tribe that generally have a more broader focus of things, where a circle is much closer to like a corporation. A circle is a group of Minmatar that may actually be from multiple clans, multiple tribes, and all that stuff, that are bound together, generally temporarily, in order to perform a specific function, like a certain industry, or whatever, some certain societal function. And so, where was I? Oh yeah, so they're big as as a child growing up in the Minmatar Republic, your number one question is what is your place in the world, right? You go through the ceremony that you were discussing, where you get not only your destiny, but it locks in your tribal affiliation, and it really defines who you are. And that means that a lot of Minmatar people don't really get to choose who they want to be or what they want to be. What they get to choose is whether or not they want to leave, whether or not they want to be part of the Republic, whether or not they want to be a smuggler somewhere, whether or not they want to join the Federation, or whether or not they want to defect and go and work for the Amarr. So a lot of Minmatar life is about, it's almost as if every Minmatar starts out almost as a semi-lost soul and has to find where to be tethered to. That's it. That's all I got. On that happy note.
Yeah, it's a shame that we don't know more about what life is like for the general person on the ground in Eve. That's one thing that I will say I find kind of sad. Like we get a lot of stuff about like terrible things that happen to individuals, like the whole group of slaves that exist so that we can change faces as our immortal capsuleers.
Yeah, well, and I've said this many, many times, like, I want more books and movies and video games that do not involve the capsuleers, have capsuleers as basically backdrop, if anything, right? Like, I want a mystery story, murder mystery story, noir detective novel sit in Arturio or Kali. I want,
Or Jin'ta 4-4.
well, that's a whole nother thing, right? Like, no, I want Babylon 5 set in Jin'ta 4-4. That's what I want. I want to hear the stories of the people whose job it is to make sure that 4-4 doesn't just explode on any given day.
I would like The Wire, but it's Jin'ta 4-4.
Like they're
that'd be
stockades.
rad. Yeah, just like a police procedural. Just going through and solving crimes in Jin'ta 4-4. It'd be great. There was a serial killer in Jin'ta 4-4 for a while, actually, that was a capsuleer. That was a chronicle.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. Like, there's so many more interesting stories than just immortal space gods. Like, and I think that one of the problems is that a lot of players don't properly appreciate the fact that in this sci-fi universe, I mean, yes, there's Triglavians and Drifters and all that stuff. Those are relatively new. We are the monster. We are the Cylons. We are the scary thing that goes bump in the night that they don't know what to deal with and is an existential threat to all of mankind. But it just so happens that we're super useful if they throw money at us. So what do you do?
I want to see like the Reddit thread on like Galnet that's about, so what about those capsuleers, huh? I want to see like our Ask Reddit, but in Galante space. Like, how big of a dick has a capsuleer ever been to you?
So one of the scenes that I had in my mind is like a bunch of Galantians going to the movies, and at the very beginning of the movie, there's like a propaganda ad for the Concorde, the thin blue line against the Capsuleer menace. Trust Concorde.
That'd be amazing. I'd be so down for that. Like I just want to know more about what life is like for the general people in Eve. Not even like from the context of a show, but I'm just genuinely curious about like how all this technology filters down, and if it doesn't filter down, why doesn't it filter down? Like what creates this persistent society that we see, and like what forces act on it? What are people worried about on a day-to-day level? Like, I find all of that minutiae of like individual human experience to be very personally interesting in basically any genre.
I think it's to the credit of how convincingly real CCP has actually made this video game setting, right? Like, as gamified as we like to think of it as, I mean, the story holds up. It's an interesting universe that's filled with, we can even say, like, in order to fully understand the Minmatar people, you have to understand how they culturally grew up on their planet and how that influenced their culture. Like, that is really cool. right? Like it's not just, oh yeah, here are the pointy-eared guys, they're smart. Here are the guys with, hard shells on their back, they're angry. Here are the, the blue people, they read people's minds. Done. Let's go. Sci-fi universe.
I think that here's the blue people. They live in trees, and we kill them in a over. I was gonna make an Avatar joke, but I fucked it up. Sorry.
See, I went Fifth Element, but yeah, sure.
Yeah. Well, you're a different generation to me, so we've got like different references for blue people.
That's fair. That's fair. That's very interesting. But yeah, I mean, I think that Eve Online, the universe, New Eden itself, like our stories are really interesting in Eve, and that's great. But I think that the stories of the universe itself is also really interesting, and it makes sense that us as immortal space gods are a bit above all of that, and so I get how the game itself is very much derivative of the player's efforts because it's the player's story. This is the Capsuleer's story in this universe, and it's from our lens. But it just makes me wish that there were other lenses to view this universe through.
Absolutely. Well, it has been amazing as always. Do you have any final words for our wonderful listeners, and where can they find you if they would like to hear more about the delicious lore or any of the other things that you are interested in with relation to EVE Online and indeed other games?
Sure thing. I am Ashterothi. You can find me on Twitter at Ashterothi, or you can watch my live stream, twitch.tv/Ashterothi. I stream every weekday, touch and go on Fridays, where I stream invasion content and other things that attract my interest. And I discuss things like the lore and try to break down things like Triglavian social structures. And we have a lot of fun over there. And yeah, hold on. I just trailed off there, but I think somewhere in there you got a good answer.
No worries. And if you want to follow me, I am on twitch.tv/frigate menace. And I'm also just Jin'taan Eve on Twitter. Still, thank you for watching, everyone. And until next time, fly smart. A special thanks as always goes out to our Crassuses, Pinche Infidel from Old School, Brood from Triumvirate, and Zolka Lando, as well as to our other $5 and above patrons in Dustin Prater, Meeks, Zar, Olav Olden, Kem, Raphael, Big Bada Boom, and Dunk Dinkle. If you want to support the channel yourself, you can either check out the Patreon link in the description below, or just share the video with someone you think might enjoy it. Until next time, fly smart.